I'm Bill Fodor, weekday morning host at Classical 88.7 KCME, and I'd like to welcome pianist Jeffrey Biegel to KCME's Culture Zone. Hello, Jeffrey.
Hello, Bill.
Well, it's good to hear you finally and talk to you. We've had an exchange of emails and text messages and the like, and I'm glad to know that you're coming to Colorado to perform with the Colorado Symphony Orchestra in Denver on September 18th and 19th in what's going to be their season opening gala concert with music director Andrew Litton conducting. And it's a big program, all Beethoven. You get to open the concert with the Colorado Symphony Orchestra and Chorus, and it's just a huge program. Beethoven's Fantasy for Piano, Chorus, and Orchestra, which you'll be performing, and then it's followed by Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 in D minor, the Choral Symphony. What's it like for you to play a masterwork of Beethoven's that was really Beethoven simply flexing his creative muscles, demonstrating that he could set text to music while also writing a virtuosic part for a pianist, which was his own instrument?
It's a wonderful work because it's for piano solo to start. Then the orchestra joins in, and finally, way toward the end of the piece, the chorus enters, joining pianist and then with the orchestra. And it's a wonderful piece because very rarely does a pianist have the opportunity to play anything by Beethoven with a chorus, let alone with an orchestra. Of course, you have the concertos, but with the chorus added, it's great because it's an added musical instrument to the mix. I love choral music. I've composed choral music. I always wish I had a good choral voice. Maybe that's why I like to write for choirs, because I can't sing too well. But I enjoy doing works for piano, orchestra, and chorus. There aren't enough of them, and we could talk a little bit more about that later. But what I like about this piece is that Beethoven goes into different harmonies and different worlds, different tonalities, different textures, long pedals. He was always experimenting with the latest instrument of the day. Whoever was manufacturing the new pianos would bring them to him, which is why there's such a great difference amongst all the 32 piano sonatas and, of course, the other works for piano and orchestra and chamber music. They're based on the instruments. I'm sure at the time he wrote this and premiered this in December of 1808, he was 38 years old. By then, the piano was starting to develop more and more as a pianoforte, not as much a forte piano, but pianoforte is starting to
take on a much more modern style.
Exactly. It took on a life of its own by that point. It's a wonderful work because it is a fantasy, and a fantasy is not real. And the piece almost sounds as though it's not real because it goes from world to world, harmonies to harmonies, textures to textures, and melodic lines to different melodic lines, from piece to piece to piece. It's rhapsodic in a way, rhapsodic meaning sewing pieces together, and in some ways it is a rhapsody, but at that time I don't believe the word rhapsody was used. Fantasy was the term of the day. I think the term fantasy was used more popularly amongst the classical composers until Brahms came along and, rather than fantasy, wrote rhapsodies for piano. But similarly, a fantasy and the rhapsody are sections sewn together, and this is a remarkable work. Some people complain about it. They say, oh, it's not as great as his other pieces, or, of course, the Ninth Symphony, but that came 15 years later. It's a remarkable work because he holds it together with all these various sections, which makes it very interesting.
I read something recently about the Choral Fantasy, which had its debut at, I guess today we'd call it an all-Beethoven spectacular concert on that December 22nd day in 1808, which had the premieres of the 5th and 6th symphonies and a part of his C major Mass and Piano Concerto No. 4 and a concert aria and a fantasy in G minor for piano. The concert lasted over 4 hours, and he used this choral fantasy to bring together all of the elements that the audience had heard before and put it together in one piece. And even though the concert wasn't billed as a raving success afterwards, it certainly is now. Each and every one of those pieces, I think, could be rightly characterized as a masterpiece. But the fact that this concert wasn't a raving success, mostly due to short rehearsal times, doesn't change the character and the creativity of Beethoven for the music that was performed there, did it?
Not at all. When they listened for 4 hours to all of this music, number one, it was new music to them. The harmonies, the melodies, the dissonances, what we considered not to be very harsh in sound, a G with an F sharp above it. I would say to their ears at that time, was a bit harsh. The chromaticism was still quite striking to the ear. So it was a lot for them to digest. Why wasn't it a raving success? Maybe because it didn't have a lot of rehearsal time. There was a lot of music on the program. If we went now back in time and heard it, we would have maybe thought it was wonderful, or it was a revelation, or it was an interpretation we didn't expect. We weren't there, so it's very hard for us to determine what made it or made it not a raving success. But the audiences then, to have the composers performing their own music was commonplace. For us, it would be a remarkable miracle.
That's true. And it was just over 15 years later that Beethoven completed the second work on the Colorado Symphony Orchestra program, the Symphony No. 9 in D minor, the Choral Symphony, in May of 1824. And by that time, he had become completely deaf. And even though he sat on stage with the score and kept time for the orchestra while the music director actually conducted, it must have been an amazing performance. And then the Choral Fantasy that was performed in 1808 was a demonstration piece that ended up in that Ninth Symphony. If you were to try to compare those two works, because one was done when he still had some hearing, the Choral Fantasy, and the other, Symphony No. 9, he had lost his hearing, could you do that?
I think Beethoven heard everything he wrote in his head. I really do, because the quality of the music and the construction of the music he wrote as he was growing more deaf, and when he was completely deaf, he still had a sense of sound and structure in his head. He didn't know that he was going to write the Ninth Symphony 15 years later when he wrote the Choral Fantasy. So I never feel it's fair to compare works from one period of a composer's life to another, because we're looking at it from the future back, but they're looking at it from the time they write it and don't know what the future holds. Certainly the intervallic relationship between the theme of the chorus and the Choral Fantasy, it reappears in the Ninth Symphony, and maybe he did that consciously. There is no piano part in the Ninth Symphony, so it's a totally different piece. I think the Choral Fantasy was a piece that he wrote, and then he moved on to the next piece. I don't think he says, I'll write this as a model for a bigger symphony. I don't think he thought that way. I think he just wrote as he wrote, and his writing abilities developed and matured more so over the years. He stretched the limits of tonality as his life went on, but I don't think we can compare one to the other because they're so different. The Choral Fantasy is a wonderful piece by itself, but it's interesting to see how he combines the orchestra with the chorus in both works. Aside from Fidelio, he doesn't have anything, as far as I know, that is professionally performed that combines chorus and orchestra, let alone add the piano to it, which is in the Choral Fantasy.
I'm Bill Fodor, weekday morning host at Classical 88.7 KCME, and on this week's KCME Culture Zone, I'm speaking with pianist Jeffrey Biegel, who's performing Beethoven's Choral Fantasy with the Colorado Symphony Orchestra and Chorus at their season-opening concerts September 18th and 19th at Betcher Concert Hall in Denver's Performing Arts Center. And Jeffrey, we've talked about the music that's on this all-Beethoven program with music director Andrew Litton conducting, but you feel kind of a reverse kinship with Beethoven, don't you? Could you tell me a little bit more about that and the appreciation it's given you for performing Beethoven's music?
When I was younger, I'd play any of Beethoven's pieces and learning the variations and the sonatas from a young age. I never really thought about anything related to loss of hearing. I knew Beethoven became the composer who was deaf. That's all I knew. It didn't really faze me in any way. I just learned his music and played it. But I'd been told, and I knew from old black and white movies, that I was not able to hear when I was younger. But there was never an issue made about it, and I never asked about it. I just know that at the age of 3, I had surgery to correct loss of hearing and, of course, tonsillectomy all at the same time. As the story would be unfolded, I was told that I was not able to hear as a child, which they didn't know. You know, these days, you have to have a hearing test before you bring your infant child home. They didn't have that in 1961.
No, that's true.
Your child had 5 fingers on each hand and toes and could breathe and wasn't choking and looked like he had eyes, nose, ears, mouth, and everything. He responded somehow to something. I was sent home. By the time I was 1 or 2 years old, I'm not saying words that most 2-year-olds might be saying at that time. It put a seed of doubt in my parents' minds.
Right.
And doctors would say, no. I would ask for things like a caveman. I used to point to something and make a, like that, like I want that, but without saying the word. And it raised some red flags. So some doctors would say, no, he's lazy for his age. He'll come around. what would they say? How were they testing my hearing? They weren't testing my hearing at age 2. Finally, one doctor faced me to the wall and called my name. I didn't answer, and he must have done other tests. And child's not lazy, he can't hear. I just remember vibrations. I don't remember being able to hear very well, but as the story went, the eardrum was not vibrating. There was a lot of fluid blocking it. The eardrum had to be poked to release fluid and get it vibrating. And I don't remember much. I remember going to the hospital for this operation. I remember seeing it. I mean, I'm sure when I was put out, because those days they didn't do just outpatient and twilight, you were put out. I remember floating over the operating table and seeing it happening. It must have been a point where they performed the procedure that I was able to hear, and it opened up everything to me. And I remember watching them. It was a very bright room with lights over the operating table, and I saw myself there. It must have been the most significant event in my life until that time that I became out of body. I wasn't dreaming it. I felt the floating sensation, and back in I went. So, was it significant? Did it have anything to do with my musical development? Perhaps. Was I gravitated to music because of this? Perhaps. Was vibrations of sound and music through speakers that I could vaguely decipher in the deafness? Wasn't 100% deafness, obviously. I was able to hear something. Did that contribute to my life in music? Perhaps. So why Beethoven? I started to think to myself, my gosh, I started out the way he ended up. Probably better for me, but not for him.
Yes.
And it created this sense of camaraderie with him somehow. It's like, I don't know what you went through in a way because you started out fine and ended up in bad shape. I started out in bad shape and I'm ending up okay.
Yeah.
There's this sense of knowing in a way, and I do remember the sensation of not being able to hear. And I remember being pushed around, but I also remember not being able to hear everything going on around me.
But your repertoire reflects not only your ability to hear, but your ability to create sounds that are just absolutely amazing. You've recorded, 15 CDs now, and they range from Johann Sebastian Bach all the way up through contemporary composers?
Yes. I think starting out with a handicap gives you this feeling that I've been able to overcome the handicap. And it gives you a sense of not being limited at that point because you know what that sense of limitation was. And once you're free, you feel perhaps freer than the normalcy. And I've never felt compelled to be bound to tradition. I said Beethoven didn't know he'd write the Ninth Symphony when he wrote the Choral Fantasy. I didn't know 30 years ago I'd be playing works like Keith Emerson or Neil Sedaka or a New Monkeys concerto in January or other pieces that have not been written, or I'm creating projects for works to be premiered. I mean, I would never have thought of that when I was following tradition as a student. So being somewhat limited gives you a chance, once you're free, to strip yourself of the limitation. I think once Beethoven started to know that he was going to be deaf, did he know he'd be totally deaf? Probably not. But as it got worse, he probably sensed that was his fate. And that's when the music started to stretch beyond the limits of what was normal for his time. That's why structure of pieces became stretched to the point where you can almost snap the rubber band, but you don't. It never quite happens. And tonality also he took to other levels, enabling composers in the future to take it from where he left off. So there's this sense of being limited, being freed from the limitation, and broadening your horizons without fear of being judged. And in that capacity, I felt a kinship with Beethoven in a way. Not 100%, but there is this kind of familiarity with the limitation.
Well, it can certainly give you an appreciation for what he faced later in life as he began to write music once he realized that he was losing his hearing. Now, we know that you're coming to Denver to perform at the season opening concert for the Colorado Symphony Orchestra. What else have you got going on? Where you're based? What projects are you working on? What's your teaching like?
I teach at Brooklyn College. I'm coordinator of piano studies at the Conservatory of Music at Brooklyn College, and we get a wonderful group of students coming and going all the time. They want to be in the New York area. They either want to be professional pianists or teachers or administrators, and it's a wonderful group of kids we get every year. Home base is outside of New York for teaching and then preparing for concerts. New York's got the airport, so it's easy to get in and out wherever you have to go. I keep these standard pieces going and playing Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto and Saint-Saëns Concerto, number 2, the Grieg Concerto, Rhapsody in Blue, but delving into a lot of different territories with recording and performance. I'm going to record Lucas Richmond's piano concerto that he wrote for me, and recording Rhapsody in Blue with Duke Ellington's New World of Coming, with Keith Emerson's concerto and Neil Sedaka's Manhattan Intermezzo in one CD with the Brown University Orchestra this fall. Going to premiere a piece that Peter Tork from the Monkees dabbled with for piano and orchestra, a bit different, a bit jazzy, which will be on the same program with Orchestra Kentucky in January, with a new work attributed to the Monkees music by Dick Tunney from Nashville. And then Ken Fuchs is writing a concerto for me. Lyra Auerbach is going to premiere a new concerto that she's writing for next year, and then I'll take the mantle from there and try to premiere it with orchestras that want to be part of the commissioning project. Also debuting with a new trio, which is Glenn Dicterow and Robert Demain, violinist and cellist.
Oh, I saw that. I saw that in your biography. I was just excited to learn when you may begin to record some pieces with them.
It's such a new ensemble. We're premiering in January on the Chamber Music Society of Fort Worth. We're going to do Brahms B Major Trio, the Suk Elegy, which is not performed often, and the Dafyani Quintet No. 1 with a couple of other members. And it's called the Dicterow Demain Biegel Trio. I put myself last because I must have Glenn first. He's a wonderful friend and a wonderful musician, and I couldn't be more honored than to have these two instrumentalists in this trio with me. So it's a baby. It's just been created. I know we'd love to do Beethoven triple concertos in the future and hopefully record. And we'll set the sail in January and see where the ship goes.
Well, so that sounds like it's something special that's on the horizon for you. Anything else that's special there?
We're trying to keep everything going, but I do enjoy the variety of the repertoire. In fact, doing a lot of the newer pieces helps keep the tried and true fresh, and it also makes me appreciate what went into writing the pieces that we're so accustomed to hearing on a daily basis. They're quite remarkable, but I understand it more from learning and also composing newer pieces, because I can never imagine being in the shoes of Bach or Beethoven or Mozart or Haydn, just not. But it gives me a greater appreciation to interpret their music. I'm studying new scores and dabbling in composition myself.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much for sharing some of your valuable time and insight with KCME's Culture Zone. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I can't wait to get back to Denver. I've loved coming there to perform since it must have been 1988, when you had a chamber orchestra and Joanne Folletta was the conductor. So I was there a few times with Joanne and enjoyed it very much. And it was in the middle of the 2000s. It must have been around 2007 or 8 when I was with the Colorado Symphony and performed Lowell Lieberman's Third Piano Concerto, as the orchestra was a member of the consortium commissioning the new concerto. So hopefully I'll get to see a lot of the people and the audience from back then. Looking forward to it very much.
Well, perhaps we'll get to see you in Colorado Springs sometime in the near future, too.
That would be great. I'd love to be back. Was there several years ago with Larry Smith conducting, and that would be another interview because he was an icon.
He was.
And he was a tremendous inspiration to me because he loved American music and was pretty much a father of fostering American music in this country with the Louisville Orchestra. We stayed in touch over the years, and we ended up doing a wonderful pair of concertos several years ago. It was Keith Emerson's concerto and Leroy Anderson's concerto. We stayed in touch after that until, of course, his sad passing recently. He was a pioneer, and he always wanted to do more than everybody else was doing. I think he wanted to teach conducting via Skype and called me once, and we talked about it a bit, but I think then his health started to fail, and he never saw that through, which was a shame. But he was a wonderful man. So Colorado Springs is a truly wonderful orchestra thanks to him, and I'm sure they're in wonderful hands now.
Well, once again, thanks to Jeffrey Biegel, the pianist who's performing Beethoven's Fantasy for piano, chorus, and orchestra with the Colorado Symphony Orchestra and Chorus in the Denver Performing Arts Center's Betcher Hall on September 18th and 19th, with music director Andrew Litton conducting at their season opening concerts. I'm Bill Fodor, and now back to KCME's Culture Zone.